When I was 12 years old, the first time I deer hunted with my dad, he was in a tragic hunting accident, and a gentleman mistook him for a deer. A young gentleman, 21 years old, had just got out of the Army. He was hunting with his family, and it was the last day of deer season, December 14, 1974. There was about 3 feet of snow on the ground, and my dad was breaking trail. He was 6'4". He was a big guy, and my brother Dan was 14, I was 12, and my grandpap were following behind him. And we got down in the woods before daylight, and Dad dropped off Dan and put him on a stand, and my grandpap, and then he dropped me off. And since it was my first time of hunting, he said, "Mark, I'm just walking down over the bank. I won't be far from you, and if you need anything, just yell." And I saw his flashlight go out of sight, and I didn't know that that would be the last time I'd ever see my daddy alive. And he went down and got nestled underneath a hemlock tree and got all situated, and it got daylight, and this gentleman's family came in and was doing a deer drive, and they were yelling and screaming, and of course my dad was looking down over the bank waiting for deer to come up over the bank where he was hunting, and this gentleman walked up behind my dad, and my dad, we had fluorescent orange vests on, which was not even a state law then, but we had them on, and my dad was underneath a hemlock tree, and there was only like a pie plate opening, and the guy looked under the hemlock tree, and he saw black, and he thought it was a buck's nose, and it was my dad's long black sideburn. And he thought, well, that must be a buck. And he waited and watched, and then the snow would start melting off the tree, and it looked like antlers. And in this guy's mind, he convinced himself that it was a big buck hiding underneath this hemlock tree. And as his family, dad and parents, came closer and were yelling, trying to drive the deer, he thought this deer was going to bolt out from underneath this tree. So he took a careful aim, and he shot, and he hit my dad right above the sideburns. And he went running over and looked underneath the hemlock tree, fully expecting a buck, and there laid my dad. As a result of that, my brother and I got very angry. We questioned God, why he would allow something to happen like that, because my dad was a very godly man. He was a Sunday school teacher, a deacon, a godly husband. And for many years, we didn't understand it. My brother's biggest complaint was our next door neighbor was an alcoholic, and he would beat his wife and children. His daughter would come over and hide at our house to keep from being beat up by her father. And then our other next door neighbor was the guy who owned the bar and who sold the alcohol. And my brother would point up to this guy and say, "God, you should have taken one of those two guys, not my dad." And for many years, we were both bitter and angry at God. And probably 8-10 years after that, my brother went back to Pennsylvania. We moved to Virginia after I graduated from high school in 1980 for both of us to go to Liberty University. And one weekend, my brother went back and went to see my grandma, and there was a gentleman on the porch, and he asked my brother to come over and talk with him. And when my brother walked up, he realized it was the gentleman who owned the bar. And in his mind, he thought, "You should be dead, not my dad. It should have been you." And the gentleman's name was Paul, and he invited Dan to come up and say, "Dan, I need to talk with you." And he went on to tell the story about how every weekend our gardens butted up against each other. My dad and he would be out there planting in the garden, and my dad would share Christ with him. My dad's best friend was Jesus, and he would share Jesus Christ openly with guys on the track team that he was a coach of. As he would teach evolution in his science class, he would teach what he believed about Jesus Christ being the only way to God, and he would openly share his faith. And Paul's excuse always was, "I got plenty of time." My dad's nickname was Walt, and he would say, "Walt, I got plenty of time." And when he came home that day, his wife informed him, said, "You know who died today?" He said, "Walt Witt, our next door neighbor." And Paul realized that we don't have a guarantee of tomorrow. And a few weeks later, Paul knelt by his bed, and he trusted Jesus Christ to be his Lord and Savior. And he sold his bar, and he wanted to do whatever he could to share Christ with people. So he would go into nursing homes, 3 or 4 nursing homes every weekend, and talk to these older people who he said were much closer to dying. And he would share Christ the best way he knew how. He would smuggle Bibles into China because he figured the people in China didn't even know about God. And he did that, and eventually he became a pastor of a church and in a small community near where we grew up in Myersdale, and predominantly because of my dad's witness and testimony. And at that point, we started realizing, God didn't make mistakes. He was perfect. He never left us. Through circumstances, we ended up going back to the tree where my dad was killed, and Eddie Nickens, who is the writer of the Field and Stream article called Following Our Father, interviewed us. It has now become the #1 article ever put in Field and Stream. A few million people have read our story. Thousands of people have come to know Christ through my dad's godly life, godly example through our story, our testimony. When Field and Stream called to interview us and they wanted to interview this gentleman, I said, well, before you do, I want to talk with him. My mom met with this gentleman the next day and forgave him. I talked with him and I forgave him and told him that we have moved on and I'd love for him to find Christ and love for him to meet my dad one day. And he said, I just can't forgive myself. He hasn't told his own daughters that he shot and killed my dad. And it's been 41 years and we're praying that, you know, one day his heart will soften up and that he will find Christ and find forgiveness and healing.
How great the love of Jesus Christ. Upon the cross of Calvary, the blood was shed that pardons me. No longer bound, no